Okay, let me share my screen. And then let me go to slideshow. Okay, so can everyone see this?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right, so today we're going to be exploring the intersectionality of climate change, environmental justice, and nuclear weapons abolition, as Becca has let you all know. Oh, there we go. So just brief agenda. We'll do like a quick warm-up discussion question. I'll talk a bit about who I am, give more of my background and like why I'm doing the work I'm doing. I'll talk a bit about the work that we're doing on the nuclear weapons abolition program at PSR. And that'll lead into this idea of intersectionality as a framework for, advocacy and the work that y'all are doing. Then we'll have like another closing discussion question, and we'll leave time for Q&A. And as I was saying, I talk kind of fast, so we may have more time for Q&A than just 15 minutes. But to start off, kind of a warm-up discussion question, I wanted to hear from y'all. When you hear the word intersectionality, like what do you think of?
And oh, Savannah, awesome.
Yeah, I think of the similarities between two maybe at first glance dissimilar qualities, especially like social qualities. Like you hear it a lot, like the intersection, like I've talked about the intersectionality between like homelessness and public health, right? So these things have like underlying causes, right, that you don't always think of when you first just say like one word or the other.
Absolutely, absolutely. And kind of like going along with what you were saying, I saw that Abuka in the chat was saying it's like a bridge, and that's very true. It's often like a bridge to, connecting, to, as Savannah was saying, kind of seemingly contrasting ideas or issues. But then, as you're crossing that bridge, you realize that they have a lot more similarities than you'd think. Any other thoughts? Anything from you, Abdul?
I think it's the same as you said, connected. That's how I see it.
Yeah, so glad to know that, it's something that, it's a concept that is very, I think, intuitive and something that a lot of people kind of already do, but like may not know, like, intersectionality is just kind of putting a name to it in a sense. But great. So a bit about me and why I kind of got into nuclear weapons abolition and nuclear weapons in general was very happenstance. It was not intentional, I will say. It was like my sophomore year of college, 2017. I needed an internship for the summer, and the only one that seemed like it would maybe fall in line with my, goal of getting an international studies degree was with Outrider Foundation, which is a foundation based in Wisconsin. And they seek to educate the public on nuclear weapons and climate change. And I was like, okay, like, this seems cool. This seems interesting. Like, I'll learn about nuclear weapons. Why not? But what actually, so, I started learning about the history of them and the technical aspect, and, kind of this very comprehensive overview of not only what these weapons are, but the ways that they do impact our lives and have impacted our lives that we may not really be aware of. And the reason that I think I really got into this work and really started to get interested was because Outrider was approaching it from a very like human-centered, environmental-centered perspective where, I was researching the ways that these weapons have impacted communities and their impacts on the environment and all of these different things that I wouldn't have really associated with nuclear weapons before, because I was always like, oh, I'm just thinking about the technical, the nuclear physics aspect and like all of that stuff. But it really opened my eyes to like a much more nuanced view of these weapons. And I would say the issue that really got me into this and really kind of pointed me down this path was learning about the Democratic Republic of Congo's like role in World War II. The Shinkolobwe mine in the DRC is actually where we sourced like 80% of the uranium that we used to in the atomic bombs that we dropped over Japan. And you know, after that, in around 1960 or so, when the DRC gained independence, you know, and they elected their first democratically elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, you know, his stance was, I'm not going to allow the US access to, you know, this mine and our resources like this anymore. And like, he was actively seeking some partnerships with the Soviet Union. And, you know, this was all during the Cold War. And as a result, you know, the US helped assassinate him, you know, the first democratically elected prime minister of this new country. And we assassinated him because he was no longer going to allow us access to this mine. And then, you know, we helped prop up a dictator for like 30 years or so, you know, Mobutu Sese Seko. And so learning about the ways that like we helped in the destruction of this country, you know, across the world for the sake of these weapons and this idea of becoming a global hegemon, it really like got to me. And I was like, it just really highlighted for me like why these weapons need to go, because they have and continue to actively destroy communities. And it's often the most marginalized and the most oppressed communities around the world and even within the US. So that like really catalyzed me. It's what I kind of wrote like my senior thesis on. And then I turned it into an article for Outrider. And so then, you know, graduation, I was like, I need to do something. And I applied to grad school and I continued my studies and got a master's in nonproliferation and terrorism studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. And it just helped me, you know, learn a lot more about the policy aspects and the technical aspects. But there wasn't a whole lot of room for me to continue to like nurture my interest in really focusing on the human impacts and advocating on these issues and centering them when we're talking about nuclear weapons as a case for disarmament. And I didn't actually really get that started until like a year ago. I started working with Rethink Media because I was getting really into, you know, messaging and understanding that our field, you know, the anti-nuclear field has a big problem with messaging on these issues, which is very much contributing as to why there isn't really much of a movement around nuclear weapons abolition or much of an understanding of nuclear weapons beyond just, you know, history and pop culture. And so that kind of then led me down this path of advocacy and organizing and led me to PSR. And so that's just kind of like my origin story, as I like to say, as to why I really got into these issues and why I am very passionate about fighting for nuclear weapons abolition. And a lot of it also has to do with this idea that knowing that these weapons do impact our lives on various levels that like a lot of us aren't aware of, and I wasn't aware of until I started studying them. And so I didn't know it, but at the time I was already working from a very intersectional standpoint, but wasn't able to name it really until now. So that's just a bit about me. And so now I'm going to talk a bit about some just basically like two aspects of the nuclear weapons abolition program's work. We do a lot of stuff, working with coalitions, you know, other organizations in the space and in other movements, just trying to reduce the military budget and advocate on nuclear abolition and all these other issues. But I would say that the thing that really launched PSR into, you know, using an intersectional framework for all of our work was our Demand Access campaign. This started at the beginning of the pandemic and just understanding that our government was not equipped to handle such a massive like public health issue because we have, you know, understood security as this two-dimensional understanding of, you know, the way we keep ourselves secure is the military. That's how we do it. Weapons, war, that's how we keep ourselves safe. So therefore, we throw all of our funds into the military and kind of forget the rest. And as we saw with the pandemic, that's not sustainable, and that actually, our security is a much more three-dimensional, complex issue. And there are so many other, problems that can affect our security, like a pandemic, for instance. And so it started off as this like fund healthcare, not warfare campaign, and, mass not missiles, and trying to just push for our government to like kind of realign its priorities to actually address, the American people's, security concerns. And, along the way, excuse me, along the way, that got transformed. We worked with young health professionals and got an idea of what they believe, would make this campaign successful, and like, what folks need out of this campaign. And that was that, we need to broaden this. There are so many issues that are impacting our proximate security that we need to address. And how we do that is divesting from the military. And as well, indignation is key, not being afraid to show that we're upset and that we're angry with the way that our government is not actually, serving the people, but is rather just working for, those who have a few vested interests in some of, the military and some of these other issues that get all of the funding. And so throughout a whole process, this campaign morphed around this idea, of this quote that you see here, that for as long as we fund violence to quote unquote keep the peace, our access to healthy minds, bodies, and environments is denied to our communities. And so we really were honing in on this idea that the military cannot save us from everything. That is just not possible. It is not feasible. It cannot attack every problem. And therefore, we need to actually start reinvesting in our communities and reinvesting in our public health and all these other infrastructures that will actually better improve the security and the lives and the health of American people. And so, this is being launched. It's kind of like the NWA program's version of, the Next Gen Climate Ambassadors. And it is our hope to have y'all, down the line work more together once the Demand Access campaign is, on more solid ground, because we're still very much in the early phases of the campaign. But throughout this process and trying to, launch it and find its place within not just PSR, but the anti-nuclear community, we learned that we can't keep our intersectional work to just this campaign, that like, that's not genuine. And it's disingenuous to think that we can just keep it to this, that it's, we can silo it off and then do everything else. Because, through it, we learned that intersectionality, it's not an end goal. It really is a framework, and it's something that you have to keep working towards. And it's something that if we want to be successful in our work, and if we want to see a world free of nuclear weapons, we have to start working together, and we have to, start building a broader movement that includes movements that are working on other issues that are affected by nuclear weapons, and just trying to build a broader, people power to show the government that like, we're not going to put up with this anymore, and that y'all actually need to listen to us and actually like do what needs to be done to keep us safe. And so another way that has manifested is the Poor People's Campaign. Earlier this year, PSR became a mobilizing partner of the Poor People's Campaign and their Moral March on Washington into the polls that happened actually, like 2 weeks ago on June 18th. And the reason that we're really excited and wanting to be a part of this campaign is because of this idea that we know that we cannot get rid of nuclear weapons with just our small anti-nuclear community. It is just not feasible. And that these issues really do have an impact on the other problems that people have to deal with on a daily basis that are affecting their proximate security concerns, like, poverty and racism, food insecurity, lack of access to clean drinking water or healthcare or housing. And, the list goes on, really, that all of these issues are connected. And it makes the most sense for all of us, if we want to see a more just and equitable world for all, that we come together. And so we did a lot of mobilizing the past couple of months to really get the anti-nuclear community to show up and show out for the Poor People's Campaign, and to show why it's important that we're doing this work, and also to show the Poor People's Campaign that like we really are here for the long term, and we are here as support. We're not just doing this to serve ourselves, but the understanding that like for the world that we are all fighting for, we do all have to work together. And so it was I had such a great time. It was such an empowering day as well. And just like hearing from folks from around the country talk about their experiences and, you know, all of the horrors that they've had to go through because our government is just not, it's ignoring people, and it's ignoring the issues that are actually affecting people's lives, and just writing blank checks to the military without any questions, you know, despite the rampant waste, fraud, and abuse that's happening. And so it was a really great experience. And like, we're going to continue to be working with the Poor People's Campaign. And I'm sure that there'll be ways for like y'all to get involved too down the line, and for demand access as well. So I'm excited to see, you know, what comes to fruition, you know, after this big event. But now I kind of want to take a step back and talk a bit more about, you know, intersectionality and what it means, and what it means to utilize it as a framework. And I really like this quote from Audre Lorde, that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And I feel like this is the core of why it is so important that we do intersectional work, because there isn't just one thing that is affecting us. Like I'm sure we all feel this, that it feels like we're being inundated with things left and right that seem to be, you know, affecting our ability to not just like survive, but also like thrive, which is really important. You know, survival is not the healthiest way to live. You should be living in a way that allows you to thrive as a human being and flourish and be comfortable and happy and safe. And we can't really get there without this understanding that all of these issues are connected, and that the way that we combat them, and that we do work for a better world, is by combating them together, and really highlighting those intersections, and making it clear where these issues connect for folks, and meeting them where they're at, you know, and trying to bring them in. And so, you know, as it says here, you know, what that means is examining the ways that multiple identities interact to create unique patterns of oppression, which is the core of what we're trying to do, you know, on the NWA side, and trying to be more intersectional, and showing the ways that not only do all of these other issues intersect, but to add on to it, how nuclear weapons also add on to our patterns of oppression, but then also how we can actually, you know, solve that and get rid of that aspect of oppression. And so it's really important. And some ways that, you know, as we've been doing this work, like disclaimer, I am not like the expert or even really much of an expert on intersectionality. Like, it's something that we are learning along the way, and that, you know, there are folks who have been doing this work and who have been doing it spectacularly, that like, please go research and learn about what they're doing. But just something like some tips that we've, you know, gathered as we've been doing this work over the past however many months, is kind of what I mentioned before, this idea that intersectionality is a framework. It's not an end goal. It's not really something that you can quantify or check off a list, be like, okay, did that, like moving on. That it's something that you really have to like do every single day, and to make sure that you're incorporating it and it coming from this perspective in all the work that you're doing. You know, so it's kind of like DEIJ in that sense, where DEIJ is also not an end goal. Sorry, let me not use acronyms. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. That's the acronym that we use at PSR. That's also not really an end goal. It's something that you have to work on every single day to ensure that folks who are working in your organization are supported and seen as human beings and equal, and just being able to do their work the best they can without any of these, you know, problematic factors. So it's just this idea that, you know, once you kind of get it out of your mind that this is an end goal, and understanding it's something that you're going to be working towards every day, then you're coming from a more, in a sense, like genuine and authentic and productive framework, in a sense, or perspective. And also, I think what's really important too, is that intersectionality has to be reciprocal. It is not transactional. So you cannot go into a space and be like, listen, you have to drop everything you're doing and care about this issue because it's the most important thing that's affecting all of us right now, which is something that quite a few, anti-nuclear activists have done in the past, is this kind of belittling and condescending way of approaching people and saying, like, you have to care about this because this is going to kill us all if you don't, and blah, blah, blah. And it really, it's, again, as I was saying, it's quite condescending because people are not dumb. People understand that there are a bunch of issues that are impacting their security. But the thing is, they have so many other issues that are impacting them on a more day-to-day level that are far more important for them to be concerned about than, say, in their mind, what, nuclear weapons and this idea of nuclear annihilation. And, there's this idea of, there you have the concerns of, am I going to have enough money to put food on the table? Or if they walk outside my door, am I going to be shot? And all of these different issues that they have to be concerned about on a daily basis that we're all experiencing. And it can be frustrating for them to then be told that, like, oh, but you have to focus on this instead. And so what it really means is, showing up, listening, providing support to these movements, and showing that you really are genuine about your goal of, like, building community and wanting to work together and building a broader movement. And also just, like, highlighting too, just the ways that these issues connect. It's not coming in and saying that my issue is more important. It's saying, like, hey, look, this is what you're concerned about. Listen, like, this also is affecting that as well. Like, maybe we can work together. And then starting to build that relationship. And how you also do that too is, like, humility and authenticity. Again, like, these are all just, like, from experiences and ways that I have seen people advocating and trying to organize and build a movement that haven't been very effective because it's coming from a more inauthentic and, like, self-righteous perspective. And people can see through that. Again, people are not dumb. They understand when you're coming in with an ulterior motive, and they're not going to really want to work with you at that point. So it really is, like, being humble and being, authentic in what you're trying to do, which is working for a better world and trying to work for a better world together. And so these are just some tips that, we've picked up along the way. I'm sure there are so many more, but these have been found as to be, like, core tips to take with you as you begin this work, and as you, like, start to lay the groundwork for utilizing, an intersectional framework and things like that. And so I wanted to kind of just provide some examples of the ways that, like, climate change, environmental justice, and nuclear weapons abolition / just, like, security in general do intersect. And just these are examples that I have come across in, like, the however many years I've been doing this work. But we know that there are countless others. So, for example, one, climate change, sea level rise, that's something we hear about all the time. And it does directly threaten military readiness because with, sea level rise, it will absolutely, and it already is, threatening military bases along coasts. And so that has an impact on how our military is able to operate. Another example, increases in, droughts, lack of access to clean drinking water, food insecurity, and all of these other kind of consequences of the climate crisis often lead to poverty and displacement, and this can increase the likelihood of conflicts breaking out. And if these conflicts are between, nuclear countries that have nuclear weapons, it could potentially go nuclear. So one non-nuclear example is the Syrian Civil War. I'm sure, as you know, that one of the factors that led to the civil war was climate change, and the fact that I believe that there were, they were farming cotton in Syria, and just the ways that, the irrigation systems and the ways that they were doing it was not sustainable. And with just the immense droughts, they could no longer, continue farming. And so a lot of folks in rural communities started moving to the cities. And that caused a lot of issues with overcrowding. And there were a lot of other like non-climate factors that were also feeding into this. But climate definitely kind of adds that extra pressure and really ups the ante and creates higher tensions that, you know, could lead to conflict. And we saw that happen as a civil war broke out. And another example that is more nuclear is Pakistan and India. I'm not sure how much y'all are aware of the kind of fraught history between Pakistan and India, but they don't have the best relationship, especially now that they both have nuclear weapons. And there have been countless terrorist attacks in the decades that have passed. And the main issue is the Kashmir region. You know, after India gained independence from Britain, they were divvying up between, you know, a Hindu majority India and a Muslim majority Pakistan, and they both were vying for the Kashmir region. There were a lot of cultural ties to the region for both, but also I think it's a more kind of resource-rich area, and there are other things going on. But as part of this kind of divvying up of that region, India gained access to the upper like watersheds of the Indus River that feeds into both Pakistan and India and provides just like access to water for both countries. And there have been issues in the past with India building dams and like potentially cutting off access to water to Pakistan. And in 2019, after 40 Indian police officers were killed in a terrorist attack by, you know, a Pakistani-backed terrorist organization, India threatened to cut off access to water to Pakistan because they were fed up with what Pakistan was doing and you know, the continuing strife between the two. And because there have been multiple points in the past where like conflict has broken up between these two, that has pushed us closer and closer to like potential like nuclear conflict, this is a very fraught and like sensitive situation and a very kind of somewhat unstable region. You know, often when folks in the nuclear space are doing these models of, you know, what if nuclear weapons did go off, you know, if there was a nuclear conflict, it's usually focusing on Pakistan and India because right now with just the proximity between the two and the tense history that they have, it seems kind of like the most likely scenario where nuclear weapons could be used in a conflict. And so it's a prime example of like, as the climate crisis worsens, like we've been seeing awful heat waves in India and Pakistan, and just like really, like they are really feeling the climate crisis. And that absolutely kind of helps create this perfect storm for a conflict to potentially go nuclear. So here are these were some examples kind of more between climate change and nuclear weapons slash just like security. But then I want to talk a bit more also about like environmental justice too. Again, as I'm sure we're aware, that climate change often impacts marginalized communities the most, especially, you know, when we think about island countries and the threat of sea level rise. And it's these countries that are contributing the least to climate change, and yet are feeling the most impacts. And so that's one example between one example of an intersection between like climate change and environmental justice is the fact that like you have these marginalized communities who aren't even the problem in this sense, in this scenario, who are, you know, reaping the most consequences as a byproduct of mainly the West's actions, but also just, you know, other countries around the world. And another example I wanted to provide that to me is kind of like one of the perfect amalgamations of all of these issues is the Marshall Islands. So another, you know, Pacific Island community that during the Cold War, the US basically kicked the Marshallese off the island, off their homeland, so that we could conduct nuclear weapons tests. And, you know, apart from like when we think about the environmental justice aspect, so it's the Marshallese community, the way that their communities are built up or built is that the women often, like they have ownership to land. And as, you know, with them being kicked off their land, they were kind of stripped of that autonomy and that independence that they were able to have. Another aspect too is like with these tests and everything that's going on, there was also a violation of just like their bodily autonomy. And you know, in these searches and trying to make sure that they weren't exposed to radiation and all this stuff. You know, and that's just on top of also just being displaced from your homeland, which also takes, you know, very much a psychological and emotional and mental toll on folks. But so as well, when we kind of bring in the nuclear aspect, we basically like destroyed their homelands. And there are folks that still live there today, but it's not the same. Like there's radioactive contamination all over. Like there have been generations of harm that have been inflicted upon these communities because radiation exposure, that's how it works. It doesn't just affect you, it affects your bloodline as well. So there's, and this isn't just the Marshall Islands, but a lot of these Pacific Islands have experienced like so many children being born with birth defects or jellyfish babies where they have no like spine, no spinal system. I have just awful stories of the ways that like our actions for the sake of national security have destroyed lives, killed people, and just done awful things to these communities. And so after, you know, the US wrapped up testing, they kind of took all of that radioactively contaminated material and put it under a cement dome that they call the Run-It Dome. And now with climate change and sea level rise, that dome is threatening. There's this threat of it releasing that radioactively contaminated material back out into the environment. So this to me is kind of like the perfect storm between all three of these issues. It showcases how climate change, environmental justice, and nuclear weapons abolition all kind of fit together in the sense that like we have not only destroyed these people's homeland, but we've also created this really unwieldy and like long-lasting damaging scenario that's going to harm the environment and continue to harm these families for generations to come. Another example within the US, again, with nuclear testing during the Cold War, folks living downwind of these test sites were not, you know, told about what was going on. They were exposed to a lot of radioactive contamination or just radiation exposure. There were uranium miners, especially the Navajo, who were not given proper protective gear when they were mining, were not even told what they were mining or how dangerous it was. And as a result, were exposed to lethal amounts of radiation. And with this mining too, it has seeped into their water systems, into their groundwater systems, so that their groundwater is like contaminated. It is awful, and it continues to be awful to this day. And as well, atomic veterans, folks within the military who were listed as volunteers, but were not actually volunteers. They were forced to go into these areas where the US has tested nuclear weapons and whatnot, and you know, clean up or just do whatever it is that they were doing. And as a result, again, they were not given proper protective gear. And as a result, have all like developed rare cancers and awful just health issues. And it's not just them either. It's also their children and other family members. It really has such a widespread impact. And it shows that like this isn't something that just happens elsewhere. It also has dire impacts for folks within the US as well. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that. And like on that as well, folks living near nuclear weapons complexes like Hanford and Washington, where just last year, there were reports that these barrels at the complex were leaking radioactive material into the environment, and continuing to further contaminate the communities around that area, which, if I recall correctly, are also largely Black and Brown communities, or the Savannah River site over in Georgia / South Carolina, where that also is contaminating environments nearby and leaking radioactive materials into the Savannah River. And like a short little story time, when I was working at Outrider, I had to like learn, I was researching the Savannah River site, and I learned that after we accidentally bombed Spain, which was during the Cold War, I believe it was like the late 50s or maybe the early 60s, when we had B-52 bombers like flying around literally 24/7. They were trying to refuel one of them, and it had, I think, like 3 or 4 like hydrogen bombs on the plane. And the way that it refuels is like another plane comes up and like this long like tubal thing comes out and they try and connect it to like what a like fuel tank on the first plane and, you know, try and get the fuel in that way. But as they were like trying to do this, you know, something happens and they wound up dropping all the bombs. 2 of them landed in the ocean. And then one landed on like farmland in Spain. It was in Palmera, Spain. And it didn't detonate, so there wasn't an explosion, thankfully, but it did release a bunch of radioactive contamination onto the farmlands. And so the US's solution was to take all of that dirt, put it into cardboard boxes, and then bury it at the Savannah River site. And like cardboard does like break down. So eventually it's like all of that just leaked into the environment. And so it's made it almost just like quite toxic over there. And so these are, you know, a few more examples of the ways that like environmental justice and nuclear weapons abolition and climate change all kind of intersect. And then as well, like I've talked a bit about the money aspect because unfortunately money makes the world go round. And we all know that the US military is the largest military. We spend more on our military than the next 9 countries combined, and that includes both Russia and China. And as a result, the US military is the single largest institutional polluter of greenhouse gases in the world. And there's nothing being done about it. And, you know, a part of this is the nuclear weapons complex. You know, we spend around $40 billion a year on just basically like putting these nuclear weapons to sleep every night. They aren't even being used, and yet they're still destroying communities. And instead, like that money could be funneled to combat climate change and to help us, you know, mitigate and adapt to the crisis that's already here. And as well, you know, recently the Congressional Budget Office released a study that said that the military budget could be cut by $100 billion and still maintain military readiness. And even just that $100 billion, like the amount that we could do, the things that we could invest in with those funds to not only like combat climate change, but also reinvesting in our communities and trying to build a more robust public health infrastructure and trying to improve our public education and canceling student debt and all of these other issues, like that money could go such a long way. And instead it is being just sent to defense contractors because about 1/3 to 1/2 of our military budget actually just goes to defense contractors. It doesn't actually go to keep Americans safe. It just goes to line the pockets of these contractors. And I don't know about y'all, but like that doesn't sound like security to me. So it's very clear that like we have to change the way that we think about the military and the way that we view the military when we're trying to assess our security, and this understanding that like that's not our savior. Like we have to reinvest in these other issues, in these other infrastructures and systems, and reinvest in our communities. And that's actually what's going to keep us safe. And so these are just some examples, like I said, that I've come across in my work. There are countless others, but I did want to show 2 videos. Outrider has done this great campaign where they basically are just talking with like regular Americans around the country and the ways that they've been impacted by nuclear weapons and climate change, and showcasing not only how these issues all intersect, but also like why it's so important that we not only get rid of these weapons, but also take the money that we're spending on that and other kind of useless weapon systems and investing that in, you know, trying to combat the climate crisis and trying to just improve the overall like quality of life for Americans. And in total, it's like 3 minutes between the 2. So we'll start with this first one.
Most people don't think about nuclear weapons, or if they
Can y'all hear that?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
I'll start it over. Just want to make sure.
most people don't think about nuclear weapons, or if they do, it's kind of like as a bad dream that would probably never happen to you. But in Burke County, Georgia, we know that nuclear weapons are taking real people's lives today. I was born and raised here, just downwind from the Savannah River site, where they make the materials for nuclear bombs. My family would go hunting and fishing and swimming in the river. They didn't know that toxic waste from the nuclear facilities upstream were leaking into the river and poisoning us all. This is the same water that mixes with toxic chemicals from industrial plants upstream. That water cools the reactors at the Vogtle Power Plant on the river here in Waynesboro and turns to steam in the air for all of us to breathe. My father-in-law had 12 plus siblings, but about half of them died from cancer. And it wasn't just our family. Cancer in the area is about 20% higher than in the rest of the country. Plain and simple, what's happening here is environmental racism. It's no coincidence they decided to put these dangerous, toxic, polluting industries just up the river from communities of color. They don't think we'll say anything. So that's what they do. Profit at our expense. We're living through an environmental crisis in this country. While these greedy people make more weapons of mass destruction, there's no regard for human lives. It's got to stop. We need to face the truth and start investing in a sustainable, fair future for us all.
So that's just one, powerful message. And then I have another from a very prominent activist on the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which is an act that has been, implemented for the past 19 years to compensate folks who have been exposed to radiation within kind of like the Southwest United States as a result of US, nuclear activities. However, it not only does not, compensate the vast majority of folks who actually have been impacted, but it also doesn't provide enough compensation for folks to actually address the health concerns that they're facing and that their families are facing. And also, it was set to expire this year in July. Luckily, we did get a 2-year extension last month. However, it's not enough. That's just a stopgap measure, and that we actually need this to not only be extended for another 19 years, but also expanded so that everyone who has been impacted by these weapons gets the compensation and the care that they need. And so Tina Cordova is, one of the main activists who is working on this as well. And she's been impacted by these weapons. So it's a personal issue for her. But with that, we'll watch this one as well.
Most people don't think about nuclear weapons. And if they do, it's as if it's something far away that could kill us all someday. But the truth is, nuclear weapons are taking lives right now. My family goes back generations in Tularosa, a town just downwind of the Trinity test site where the world's first atomic bomb was detonated back in 1945. My dad was just 4 years old when they detonated the bomb. Ash from the explosion fell from the sky for days, covering his whole neighborhood. As an adult, he would die from cancer, just like so many others in our community. Growing up, the government did a great job of trying to instill in us that we should be proud of the part we played in the country's defense. Kids would go on elementary school field trips to the White Sands Missile Range, where the Trinity test took place. Families were allowed to picnic there, and people would come home with their pockets full of trinitite, a radioactive mineral formed by the explosion. The government kept testing nuclear weapons all the way until the early 1970s through a program called Project Plowshare. One of their experiments here in New Mexico was to detonate a nuclear bomb buried 4,000 feet underground to see if that might be an effective way to frack for natural gas. Well, when the gas came up to the surface, it was radioactive. Fallout plumes from nuclear tests spread literally thousands of miles. So it makes you wonder if it's a coincidence that the US has one of the highest cancer rates in the whole world. To this day, the government has taken no responsibility for exposing people to radiation from testing at the Trinity site, but our community was less than 45 miles away from the explosion. The truth is, New Mexico is a sacrifice zone, and it's mostly Mexican and Native American folks who are the sacrifice. The US is spending $60 billion a year on nuclear weapons. Imagine if we put that money toward healthcare or education or renewable clean energy. We need to work together to create a livable planet for everybody. But that will only happen when we stop prioritizing destruction. We need to face the truth and start investing in a sustainable, fair future for us all.
Yeah, so I just wanted to also showcase, some of the work that other organizations are doing to highlight the intersectional avenues between these different issues and to help, show to folks who may not be aware, like how nuclear weapons are impacting their lives on a daily basis. And, you know, and the ways that all of these issues connect and what we need to do to move forward. But with
Most
that,
people don't think about nuclear.
how do I move on?
Most people don't think about nuclear.
I'm going to stop sharing. That was the end of my presentation. I then just had like a slide for some of the sources, for some of the facts that I shared. If folks are interested, Becca, you know, you can feel free to share my slides with people. But that's it for me. So, oh wait, I forgot the closing discussion question. My bad. Can I move on? Are they going to allow me? There we go. So to kind of close this out, and to, you know, we can also shift this into and incorporate it into the Q&A section. But I wanted to ask, you know, what are some ways that you can see your work being more intersectional with, you know, environmental justice and nuclear weapons abolition and other issues that, you know, are important?
I can start. It's not, well, I don't know. It's interesting because I'm from Georgia, and I honestly probably one of my first like environmental papers I wrote was about the Savannah River, but I honestly didn't know. So I was focusing mostly on like the chemical pollution, so like runoff from like nitrates and all stuff from like the farming, but I actually didn't know about the weapons production nearby. So I guess in terms of one thing that I think is interesting to now explore a little more on is looking at some of these, like just looking into this a little more to see how many of some of these heavy polluted communities, whether it's from chemicals, whether it's from, you know, general fossil fuel extraction, is there also adjacent other types of things like these nuclear weapons things. And it'd just be interesting to look at that, because I was like, wow, I've never, like, I know about like just our power plants in general, things like that, but I didn't know about the actual weapons being produced. And so it was interesting that something I've looked at and I just like literally went over my head.
Yeah, actually, and I'll provide a resource since you're in Georgia too. Like, I don't know if you've heard of Georgia Want, Women's Action for New Directions, but they've done great work on advocating on this issue of like the nuclear aspect in Savannah River site. So I'm just going to drop a link to their website, and that might provide you with some resources. But yeah, that site, it's responsible for producing like plutonium pits, which are like the core of nuclear weapons. And so it's like through that, and there's been other things that they've been trying to do, and projects and programs that have been delayed and have not been working, and just so many issues as to why that place should honestly just be like shut down. But like, yeah, it definitely does have like that nuclear component. So hopefully that website is helpful for you. And always happy to like talk more about that if you want. And I think I know a few folks who might have some more info too.
Thanks. This is helpful. So I'll take a look at this. Also, Jasmine, is your email in one of these things? Do we have your email?
I just put in the chat.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And Becca, feel free to also share my email out too.
Oh, well, for sure.
But like any other ways that folks seeing their work intersectional with like these issues or other issues? Yes, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well, so one of my majors is public health. And so, I mean, this definitely intersects with public health because a lot of the work that we're trying to do now is to help marginalized communities and help the most vulnerable among us. And so it's just really interesting to see how like nuclear weapons are doing these kinds of things that we're already learning about in like environmental health, for example. And it's like we can pinpoint the cause, which is always so hard for us to pinpoint a cause of something. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Thank you so much for your presentation. I learned so much. I also have like a couple questions. One of them is like this idea about nuclear energy versus like nuclear weapons, right? Because I feel like nuclear energy could actually be a great way to combat climate change, right? Because it doesn't rely on like fossil fuels, but people often conflate that with the negative effects of like nuclear weapons and of radiation and all this. I just want to see if you have any ideas on how we can talk about these two things separately, or just your opinion on them.
Disclaimer, honestly, I don't really know a whole lot about nuclear energy. My focus really has been like on nuclear weapons. So I don't really like have a formed opinion that I can say right now of like, one or the other. Just some of the things that I've heard, like, I know that there are concerns of like, one, how do we get rid of the waste? Because it's not like you have to dispose of it in a very careful manner. And also it like the half-life for plutonium is like 24,000 years. So that means it takes 24,000 years for it to just lose half of its like radioactive power. And so it takes even longer for it to get to a point where it's like no longer lethal or dangerous. So I know that there's concerns about like, how do we dispose of the waste and how do we deal with that aspect? And there is too, like in my studies of learning about, just the process of nuclear weapons development, like the concern of it doesn't take, there's not a huge like gap between, if you have the resources you need to create like nuclear energy, that like you could potentially go down the line towards like creating nuclear weapons. And now I know it's like, it's not something that countries at this point can really do like secretly. Like there's a lot of verification mechanisms in place and watch, like, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, basically like monitors and makes sure that countries aren't doing that. So it's like very hard in this day and age to like secretly create a nuclear weapons program. But I know that like there have been concerns about that too. So like I don't have like a whole lot of information on that. I know PSR in the past has like and I believe that they like technically still do have an anti-nuclear energy stance. I don't fully know all the reasons for that, but like if I do find some resources, I'll pass them along to Becca to share with y'all. But it's difficult. I think it's definitely like worth looking into and researching and seeing like, is this a viable energy source? But honestly, I don't feel comfortable like going beyond that because I just don't have enough of an understanding of what like of what's going on in the state of play. But that is a great question. And when I get off here, I'm like, I don't know.
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate. And then the only other question I had was just kind of thinking about like, maybe if not in America, what's been successful in other places for denuclearization? If there's been any like actually been effective, right?
So I would say the one country that comes to mind that has been like denuclearized in a sense was South Africa, and that wasn't actually due to like climate reasons or anything. It was actually a bit like more racist. After apartheid, basically like they just didn't want Black people to have nuclear weapons, so they were like trying to work to like basically stall the program that South Africa had started. I don't know if they ever actually like developed weapons, or if they did, it was a few, but like after the fall of apartheid, they basically were like, we don't want Black people to have nuclear weapons, so we're gonna get rid of them. But apart from that, like I would say it's not necessarily like, I guess it is a denuclearization effort, but like the TPNW has gained a lot of popularity and footing like around the world, especially in non-nuclear weapon states, and a lot of these states that have been impacted by nuclear weapons on behalf of like the United States and other nuclear weapon states. And that's the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was ratified in actually last January in 2021. And they had the first meeting of states parties last week. And, there's a lot of excitement around that, but it's one way that like countries are basically saying to nuclear weapon states, like, we're not going to wait around for you anymore to like say that you're going to follow through on your commitments to disarm under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And we're actually going to like, we're kind of holding their feet to the fire in a sense. And so that is a really interesting like case study and like hopeful avenue for us to hopefully apply enough pressure to nuclear weapon states to just start to actually like recommit to their disarmament commitments that they made, and actually try and like create a world without nuclear weapons. So I think that one is pretty interesting. And like, if you check out the ICAN website, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, like they have a lot of resources on it, and a lot of like information that you could learn. And like they also provide resources on like the links between racism and nuclear weapons and like all these different topics too. So that would be helpful. I'll drop the link in the chat. Go ahead, Becca.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say really quickly, I really learned a lot, like Savannah, I'm in public health, and we did do a whole section on radioactive waste and nuclear weapons, and like the conundrum, as Savannah said, between like, is nuclear energy actually the best way forward? Because it is clean energy, but it's also super expensive, and it's really hard like to keep like waste from leaking out, especially like if you think about the Ukraine war with some of the plants, like the nuclear plants were like hit, and luckily they didn't spill any radioactive waste, but it could have. But one thing that I thought of that I hadn't really thought of before was like, you brought a lot of attention to like the military budget, and just in general how many funds were pouring into the military. But it just made me think of like the whole access issue and how this relates also to like abortion access, I think, like our bodies. And that's kind of the crux of it, is like we are denied access to so many things and freedoms and like control over what is either like in our environment that's affecting our bodies, our ability to like, if you have a uterus, if you're a person with a uterus, to have an abortion. And we don't really have a say over like where our military budget is going. But it made me think about how intersectional like the military complex is with climate change, because not only are we pouring money there, but we're also the money that's going there and like funding war and all that, that's also increasing greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So it's like really upsetting, to be honest, but I really appreciated your presentation anyways.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point of the demand access campaign, is like, we don't have access to the resources we need to like survive and thrive as human beings. And that also strips away our like autonomy in many aspects as well, as you were saying. And so it's all about demanding access to the resources that we deserve. These are taxpayer dollars that are being spent. And also it's just our right as like residents of this country to, have our government actually serve our interests. And that's just not what's happening. So that's what we're trying to do. But I know we've gone over, so like, I mean, I'm happy to stay on, but I'm sure folks are busy.
But yeah, I want to open it up too, if there's any other questions or comments or anything.
I have one question. This is Abdul. So do you think this war in Ukraine put all your work that you guys did in the past under strain or no?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Do you think all your job that you did in the past, this war in Ukraine, how it affect your job right now,
It has made it a lot harder. It's very hard to advocate for getting rid of nuclear weapons when a lot of folks believe that they're kind of protecting Ukraine in a sense. But if we really think about it, like the reason that the US hasn't been able to get more involved, as people were actually really hoping, is because of nuclear weapons. Because if the US did get more involved, it would become basically like a direct conflict between the US and Russia, which has a high likelihood of going nuclear. And that, coupled with like Putin and his continuous threats of nuclear use as a way to like tell countries to back off and not get involved, has also really hindered the aid that could actually be going to Ukrainians and actually helping them. And so it's difficult because, also it makes it harder to argue to get rid of them when people are saying, well, we're so insecure in the security environment, we have to have them. But if we do kind of a more broader analysis, like they're actually really contributing to the security, to the insecurity that we're experiencing. And they make conflicts like this so much more dangerous, which is why we really do need to get rid of them, because like at a moment's notice, it could go nuclear. Nuclear weapons could be used, like, and that makes it, the existence of tactical nuclear weapons, which are, they say smaller, but are actually like the size of the weapons we dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It makes them more, appealing to use and things like that. So it's been harder to like advocate for nuclear abolition, but it also has been great because folks are actually paying attention again. It's been really hard to get people engaged on these issues because, again, like there's so many other things for people to be concerned about. But there has been a huge resurgence and interest on nuclear weapons and questioning the status quo and like trying to imagine a world beyond this like nuclear order, which has been great. So it's like a mixed bag, but yeah, it's been an interesting time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I don't know if anybody else has questions. I think we could talk about this for like another hour, I'm sure. But yeah, thank you all. I know it was like a small group today, but really appreciated everyone's participation. And maybe, I don't know, this was so great. I'd love to like run this again. And I think keep tuned. We as Jasmine said, we would love to like have, you know, a little bit more collaboration between the Demand Access Campaign, which is also young and emerging health professionals, and the ambassador program you guys are a part of. But I will also send you some more info. Jasmine can give me the resources that she gave. So just keep tuned with your inboxes. And Jasmine, you already put your email in the chat, but Jasmine's good at responding. And yeah, so thanks so much, everyone, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your days.
Yeah, and like if anyone like has any questions that they weren't able to ask or like just wants to chat more, like again, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to meet. But thank you all for coming. Bye.